Hey y'all, welcome to Night and Day, where we're going to be talking about some of the more common myths, mistakes, and misconceptions regarding weapons and armor from the medieval and Renaissance time period. I'm Alan Johnson, and I have been involved with various aspects of European martial arts as well as stage combat over the last 20 years or so. In addition, I'm also a screenwriter, and I enjoy incorporating many of these elements into the stories that I write, as well as the ones that I consult on for others. So when looking at the topic of sword myths, we should first tackle the question of why. Why is this an important topic to discuss? Why are we bothering to get this kind of information? Obviously, it's always good to have as much information as possible. Typically, when people are interested in a topic, they'll first turn to the internet. And unfortunately, there's a lot of misinformation out there, a lot of myths and misconceptions from past years, as well as well-meaning but inaccurate people have cropped up all over the internet. So hopefully we can correct some of those errors, help to change some of that. In addition, I imagine that many of you are also involved in artistic pursuits, whether that is visual art, writing in all of its various forms, perhaps you're even involved with graphic design or even prop making. It's always good to understand what that baseline of reality is when you get started. What is real? What is accurate? Once you have that, and even if you're working in fantasy, you know which of those elements you're changing in order to make it fanciful. So you're approaching it from a place of information as opposed to a place of ignorance. As we go through these myths, it's important to note that we will be speaking in generalities. There are always exceptions and outliers that exist outside of these parameters, and there just simply isn't the time available to explore everything from all cultures across all time periods. The hope is that this will help get you pointed in the right direction and be a springboard for your own research into the topics and things that are most interesting and relevant to you. So, with that being said, here we go with myth number 1. Have you ever heard that medieval swords weigh 10, 15, maybe even as much as 30 or 50 pounds? Well, the reality is that swords are actually quite light, and well-made swords often feel lighter than their actual weight. This is one of the more easy myths to disprove, as we have thousands of swords in museums and private collections where we can get exact measurements from. In addition, there are a number of skilled modern smiths who have been able to examine these blades and to recreate them down to the last ounce. So how much did the actual real swords of the medieval and Renaissance time period weigh? Obviously, it depends on the type of sword, but most tend to be in the 2 to 3 pound range. But let's take a closer look at some of these more common categories of swords. Again, this is just supposed to be a broad overview of the more popular types and isn't intended to be an exhaustive list nor a complete representation of all weapons of that type. What makes a sword is more than just its overall weight. It's and how that weight is distributed through the blade. And how the weight is distributed depends a lot on what type of sword it is and what it's expected to do. For instance, a falchion is a specific type of sword that places a strong emphasis on devastating cuts. Most falchions are not intended to rely much on thrusting. In order to create more devastating cuts, more of the mass of the blade is sent down towards the tip where it expands into a more broad cutting surface. So naturally, the balance of the falchion is going to feel more tip heavy. It's designed that way. However, if you take a weapon like a rapier or a side sword that does place a strong emphasis on thrusting, most of the weight for these swords is in the hands. So if you have a rapier or a side sword that feels really tip heavy, it's probably not a well-made one. Some of the more common places we see this myth perpetuated is in films and video games. We've all seen plenty of depictions of a warrior in a full steel breastplate get hacked down by our hero by them hitting them square on the armor. The reality is that this would almost never happen. The idea that swords can cut through anything is simply not true. And yes, that even includes katanas. Any discussion about what swords can or cannot cut inevitably leads us to the question of sword sharpness. How sharp were swords? Again, this largely depends on the type of weapon. For instance, a small sword is almost exclusively used for thrusting. Therefore, there is no need for a small sword to have extremely sharp edges. In fact, many small swords have no sharpened edges at all. However, that's very different than the long sword, which is expected to cut. So the edges would be maintained and kept very sharp. However, sword sharp is very different than razor sharp. In order for a blade to be razor sharp, it needs to be honed down to a very thin, fine edge. While this does produce a very sharp blade, it can also become fragile and brittle. This is unsuitable for swords. Sword sharp is something different. Now, lighter swords tend to be able to handle a greater degree of sharpening, whereas the needs of heavier swords do better with a less acute angle. Renowned sword historian and sword maker Peter Johnson has stated that for some of these heavier war-bound swords, an angle of 40 degrees can still produce devastating cuts. However, there is another myth that strangely reflects the opposite of this one, and that myth states that medieval swords were essentially blunt bashing tools that were intended to crack and dent armor with their heavy rebated blows. Again, this is false for a number of reasons. As we discussed previously, we have the benefit of thousands of antique weapons that do in fact have an edge. Again, sword expert Peter Johnson stated that even a few layers of textile can pose an obstacle to a sword edge. Therefore, a sword needs to be as sharp as possible in order to easily cut fibrous materials. If a sword cannot cut this material, then it may well be the death of its owner. In addition, we also have a wide variety of maces, warhammers, and other mass weapons that bash and crush a whole lot better than swords do. So if a fighter wanted a tool to accomplish that, there are other things that do that a whole lot better than a sword can. Finally, there are also battlefield forensics that show the devastating cutting power of these swords on skeletal remains of those who died in battle and in other violent encounters. So once again, swords were absolutely sharp, just not razor sharp. Regardless, these swords, no matter how sharp they were, can almost never cut through steel armor. The reason we know this is from the dozens of historic manuals that teach people how to fight against opponents in armor. And the solution for that problem is almost never to go through the armor, but to go around the armor. These manuals show a complex system of attacks and defenses designed to get the tip of a sword into the gaps between the pieces of armor. A technique called half-swording is commonly used and can be seen thousands of times across these period texts. This also gives us another clue as to how sharp swords were, as fighters were able to grip the blade of their sword without damaging their hands. Now, if they were to slash their hand along the edge or grip it in an incorrect fashion, then certainly they could be cut. However, the manuals are quite clear that when dealing with opponents wearing steel armor, using half-swording is the technique of choice. Nothing proves a point like a physical demonstration, so we're going to do some test cutting with the sharp sword against steel armor. I've got my friend Bob here to help me out today. And of course, Bob is wearing a quilted gambeson, several layers of linen. It's a pretty thick garment. That would be standard as what people would normally wear under pieces of armor. He's got a standard breast and back plate on, and this is only about maybe 1 millimeter thick, and this is just mild steel. It's not heat treated. It's not titanium or stainless steel or anything special like that. It's got a helmet on just for good looks, and but we're going to be test cutting against the breastplate with a sharp sword. First, I'm going to do a couple of cuts. We'll take a look at what damage is there, if any, and then we're going to do a couple of thrusts and see what the damage is for there. So this is Bob, and he's going to help us out. We got this breastplate. I'm using a sharp back sword today. So it's only got a single sharp edge. The back edge is blunt, so the cross section for this sword is shaped much like a wedge. So it's a very good cutting sword, and this type of sword would have been seen probably around early part of the 16th century would be a good timeline for this. It's an adequate replica for this kind of test, and it is a sharp sword. Hopefully you saw that. But it is a sharp blade, and we'll get it tested here in just a second. And again, we're going to do a couple of test cuts against the breastplate, and then we'll take a look and see what kind of damage Bob took in this instance. All right, so let's take a look and see what we got. All right, so the first blow actually landed right here on the edge, and it did nick the corner of the armor a little bit, but obviously that's not anything that's going to deeply impact the wearer. The second blow, I think, landed right about here. There's a little bit of a scratch, an indentation, but definitely no damage. And the third one landed up here and skidded down. There's a little bit of a groove right here. But again, the Bob would have felt this. He would have felt the impact, but it would not have hurt and would have not have damaged him at all. Now, this might be in a place where if it landed and I turned it into a thrust and gone in, that could have potentially done some damage. But the cut itself didn't do anything. This full blow against the torso barely scratched it. Slight indentation. This one up here left a little bit more of a gouge in the steel, but no indentation at all. So again, cutting against steel just is not as practical. All right, so now we're gonna test some thrusts against Bob here. I'm gonna do a standard thrust on a lunge, much like you'd see an Olympic style fencer doing, or any kind of rapier fencer. Now this does have a pretty acute tip, so it is a decent thruster. And so it's a really good hybrid weapon that does both cutting and thrusting pretty good. Then I'll do a type of thrust, a slightly lighter thrust that would happen perhaps off of a repost or a parry. And then the third thrust I'll do a half sword thrust. So really strong two-handed half sword thrust, and we'll take a look and see what happens. All right, let's see how Bob fared. All right, so the first thrust on the lunge landed right here. And you see that tiny little nick right there, that little gouge, and it certainly didn't go through. The second thrust landed right here, and that was a slightly lighter thrust, and you see a smaller nick there. The third one, the half sword thrust, landed right here, and it's a tiny bit of a dent, a little bit of a nick, but nothing that would have gone through, and certainly nothing that would have damaged Bob. This is a result of another test thrust that left a little bit more of a gouge. Down here, this wasn't part of our test cutting, but there is a tiny bit of a hole here, and this was left by a much larger sword doing a half sword thrust test, and you see another cut there that came from that half sword, or that other long sword. And so you see there's damage that occurs to the armor, but absolutely nothing that would make it that would get through to the wearer and damage him in any way. Bob is just fine. Now in a test like this, there are lots of variables. There's lots of different types of swords. There's lots of different types of armor. There's people that are a lot stronger than I am. But it gives you a general sense of what can be done with a sharp sword against just regular, everyday, munitions grade armor. And that's kind of what this is. It's nothing special. It's nothing heat treated. You'll notice that it is curved and peaked here in the middle, and that's designed on purpose. One of the reasons it's for that is as you strike it, it may not stick and it'll slide off the edges. Glancing blows take it away from the center of the chest and can go out to the side. So that's part of the reason most of these breastplates were designed this way and not flat, and certainly not concave. But there's another good design in the armor, and it does what it's supposed to do. It'll take damage, it'll get beat up, it'll get scratched, it'll get dented, but it keeps the wearer safe. Many swords and knives feature a channel that runs down part of the length of the blade. This feature is many times referred to as the blood groove. This blood groove is purported to have at least one or more of the following purposes. One, to create a vacuum effect that allows blood to flow out of an opponent more easily, or to prevent a vacuum effect from sucking a blade into a body cavity, or to create more grievous wounds that cannot be closed or healed. There are a few other odd claims here and there, but most of them center around those three. Of course, the truth is that none of these are true, and this groove is not called a blood groove at all. This channel that's seen on a number of different swords and knives is actually called a fuller. So first we're going to take a look at the myths and examine why they are false, and then we'll take a closer look on what a fuller actually is and what its purpose is. Tracking myths like this is often difficult, but it appears that the origins of the blood groove may have come from an early 19th century British Army training manual. Regardless of its origins, all the claims are false and don't match up with any kind of physics or any kind of real life rationality. If these phantom vacuum effects were such a problem, or these grooves made these blades way more lethal, wouldn't have all swords and knives adopted them? Through the evolution of swords, we see many that do have fullers and many that do not. Regardless, there just isn't enough evidence to support the claims made by the blood groove myth. So what is the purpose of a fuller? A fuller essentially has two benefits. One, to lighten the blade, and two, to strengthen the blade. By the blacksmith using a special tool called a swage, they essentially pinch both sides of the blade, which forces the steel outward and creates a rise on either side of the new groove. Sometimes this rise is left in place, and other times it's hammered flat. but it essentially creates a blade that is wider but uses less steel, thus lightening it. Some have suggested that broad fullers on swords can lighten the weapon by up to 20 or 30%. Much like the creation of an I-beam, the creating of a fuller can add some structural strength to the weapon. There is complex math to support this, which I don't pretend to understand, but I trust the sources. Now, fullers can come in a wide variety of configurations. Sometimes they are single and wide. Sometimes there are multiple fullers. Sometimes they're narrow. Most of the time they're in the middle of the blade, but in certain situations, like in the case of back swords or certain knives and bayonets, they might be towards the blunt edge of the weapon. One of the more popular sword tropes that we see coming from the world of fantasy gaming, comics, novels, and films is the image of the warrior carrying a sword or even multiple swords in a scabbard across their back. The reality is that there just isn't any evidence to support that back scabbards were used in Europe. From all the antique artifacts that we have to images, illustrations, sculptures, we have so many depictions of swords being used and worn, and there just isn't any evidence to support back scabbards. The preferred method for wearing the sword was to take the scabbard and attach it to a belt and wear it at the waist. Now, there are dozens of different ways in which a scabbard might be tied or secured to a belt, but it was always done at the waist. The baldric is another belt and scabbard system in which the belt would loop over one shoulder and drape across the body, allowing the scabbard to hang down at the waist. Another method, particularly for lengthy swords, was simply just to carry them against your shoulder. We see depictions of this being done with blades and scabbards, as well as just bare blades. But that still leaves us with the question of why no back scabbards. The most obvious reason is that it's virtually impossible to draw a sword of any length, whether single-handed or two-handed, from the back. Even the early Viking-era swords had blade lengths of typically longer than the human arm, thus making it almost impossible to draw a sword from that position. In a scenario where you might need your sword quickly, that is not an effective method of carrying it. However, drawing a sword from the hip is easy, it's fast, and can be accomplished with just about any blade length. Another possible reason could be the posture that one has to take in order to draw something from their back. The position of drawing something from the back to go up and around the body leaves the fighter very exposed and very open to attack, whereas drawing from the waist, the fighter slips almost immediately into a defensive position as the act of drawing the sword from the scabbard immediately creates a barrier. People in this time period were smart. They knew how to problem solve, they knew how to invent. Now, it's almost certain that at some point somebody tried to invent a back scabbard and then quickly discarded it. There are so many other more effective ways to do this. Otherwise, we would see the back scabbard in the historical record. Another one of the more popular tropes that we see from medieval and fantasy-based fiction, movies, films, games, is the image of the skilled warrior wielding two swords at the same time. This style is commonly referred to in our day as dual wielding, and it might be two single-handed swords, two long swords, two axes, or even two mismatched blades. Now, this might seem like a great way to fight, preferable even, but the actual execution of trying to fight with two long cutting weapons at the same time is extremely cumbersome and contains virtually no added benefit over using a longer weapon and a shorter weapon, or nothing in the offhand at all. So let's talk a little bit more about what dual wielding is and isn't and what the term is typically applied to. Now, if one chooses to define dual wielding as having a weapon in each hand, then yes, this was practiced all the time across all eras through all cultures in history, especially if one considers a weapon to be a shield. Using a sword and a shield together was an extremely popular and effective method of fighting, especially in warfare, where you might be using the shield and the sword to close off multiple lines of attack at the same time. However, using a sword and shield together is typically not what people are referring to when they're talking about dual wielding. Another popular method of using two weapons at the same time is using a sword and dagger. Using sword and dagger together was extremely popular in dueling situations, as it allowed the fighter to simultaneously defend and attack. Now, this was the shorter length and the lighter weight of these offhand daggers and other weapons were extremely good at being able to cross and uncross with the other arms in the course of the fight. This feat is much harder to do if you have two long weapons. However, using a sword and a dagger together is also not what is typically thought of when talking about dual wielding. As stated previously, the dual wielding that we typically think of in these situations is almost always two swords being used at the same time. Now, people who train with swords quickly realize that there's very little benefit to using two swords at the same time. Anything that can be done with two swords can be done better and more effectively with one sword, or with one sword and an lighter offhand weapon such as a dagger or a shield. A large reason why this is never practiced in the medieval time period has a lot to do with what the sword and the fighter needs to be able to do in a combat situation. Most cutting swords, like medieval arming swords or long swords, are typically going to be encountering some type of armor. Now, if a fighter is dealing with an opponent wearing mail or plate armor, hacking and slashing at it with two swords isn't going to get them very far. What they're going to need to do is thrust into the gaps where the armor isn't. As we discussed previously, the best way that this can be accomplished is by using the half-swording techniques. This cannot be done if you're holding on to two swords at the same time. Even in situations where an opponent might not be wearing full armor, they might just be in partial armor or even padded armor, trying to hack at the thick garment with one hand is not nearly as effective as using two, or better yet, using the offhand to grapple, grab, pull, strike, push, or other actions to try and put your opponent into a more vulnerable position. That being said, there are always exceptions, and in this case, the exceptions are in the Renaissance era, where we do have evidence of training being done with two rapiers at the same time. There is also an odd configuration of this thing called a case of rapiers. Now, a case of rapiers were a version of the rapier where it's two sort of half-hilt rapiers that would actually fit together and go into the same scabbard. This style of using two rapiers is only seen in a small handful of manuals, and even then, very briefly mentioned within those manuals. Beyond this, there does not seem to be a tradition of two rapiers or two swords being used beyond this era. The masters that do teach it say that it is extremely dangerous, very difficult, and should only be attempted after somebody has mastered the single rapier. So why two rapiers, but not two cutting swords? Again, the answer lies in how the swords are designed and what they're intended to be used for. Now, rapiers are traditionally used for civilian self-defense, and thus they have less likely of an opportunity to encounter armor. In addition to that, the body mechanics of using two rapiers relies predominantly on thrusting. Now, there are some rapiers that can deliver very good cuts, but the emphasis is thrusting. And so the body mechanics of using two thrusting weapons at the same time is much easier to prevent the crossing that would occur if you're trying to cut with two weapons. Regardless, almost as soon as two rapiers appears in the historic record, it disappears entirely. On a side note, you may hear reference to using two rapiers or two swords at the same time as Florentine or Florentine style. This is not a historic term. This is a term that was invented by the Society of Creative Anachronisms, or SCA, sometime in the late 70s, and there's some debate on how exactly the word Florentine got associated with using two swords or two rapiers at the same time, but it's a made-up term and you won't really hear it being referenced anywhere outside of the SCA. Another exception for using two swords is in tournament settings. We do have a single image during the Renaissance of two armored fighters competing with a pair of blunt saber-like swords. We don't have much context other than this, but it certainly seems to be a feat of skill and strength rather than something that was trained as a serious martial art. In addition, in Japanese lore, the legendary Musashi Miyamoto supposedly developed a system of using two swords. However, there is also some debate there on whether or not it was used for actual fighting or was a skill that was supposed to strengthen the abilities of the fighter. Regardless, the historic record is extremely sparse when it comes to using two cutting swords, two long cutting swords at the same time. One of the most commonly used terms in describing swords from the medieval time period is the word broadsword. Now, this innocent sounding word has been used to describe just about any single straight edge cutting weapon used from the medieval or Renaissance time period. But the truth of the matter is that no medieval sword was ever called a broadsword. Over the last 30 years or so, we have been benefiting from the rediscovery of hundreds of documents and manuals and treatises and texts that describe historical weaponry, how it was used, and the battles that were fought. In all these documents, there's not once that we know of the mention of the term broadsword. Even in all the foreign language or the non-English documents that we find, there's not a word that would translate to the term broadsword. The Hispano-Italian swordmaster Pietro Monte wrote an encyclopedia of weaponry in 1509, and even at this late date, given the prevalence of all these types of weapons all over Europe, broadsword, or a term that would be translated to broadsword, is not mentioned in this encyclopedia. Therefore, the term was probably not in existence even as late as 1509. So what is a broadsword? Is it an actual historical term? The answer is yes. The real broadsword is this weapon. It is a basket-hilted weapon native to the British Isles with some distinct styles in Scotland, which are also referred to as claymores. Now, the first textual usage of the term broadsword that I'm aware of is from 1678, where William Veitch wrote an account of an attack made by the Highlanders, Scottish Highlanders. He said, quote, "Having their broadswords drawn, they cried claymore and made at him." A few years later, in 1678, Scottish fencing master Sir William Hope used the term in the title page of his book, The Scots Fencing Master, where he described, quote, "the way of playing with the small sword against the broad." Throughout that manual, he makes frequent use of the term broadsword to describe the Scottish basket-hilted weapon. From that point on, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of examples of the word broadsword being used to describe this sword. get muddled for this sword and for all swords in general once firearms start really appearing on the scene and taking over the battlefield. The term broadsword starts getting muddled up and mixed in with single stick and saber manuals, and eventually by the 19th century kind of becomes a catch-all word for any sword that isn't a saber or a cutlass. This error in identification was passed through the Victorian age and on through into stage combat circles, and eventually found its way into the common vernacular, into gaming circles as well. But with today's knowledge, we can properly identify what this weapon is and its place in history. We don't need to fall prey to the mistakes of previous generations, and we can appreciate the true broadsword for what it really is. Another one of the more popular sword styles seen in entertainment is the image of the fearsome fighter twirling and slashing with their sword in a backhand or reverse grip fashion. But how effective is this really? Is fighting with the sword in a backhand or reverse grip a more evolved and deadly method of fighting? Is there some sort of hidden benefit or advantage to using the sword in a reverse grip fashion? The answer is a very clear no. If you aren't familiar with the reverse or backhand style, or sometimes referred to as the ice pick grip, it is simply a way of holding the weapon in which the user changes their grip from the way they normally hold it to a reverse grip. And in this way, they try and slash and cut at their opponent as well as displace other weapons. Now, this can be done with knives and spears and other types of things. However, with the sword, this is very problematic and is not advantageous to use for a number of reasons. The first way in which it's less effective is the initial draw. If one is trying to draw the sword with the reverse grip, getting to the weapon and drawing it clear in a reverse grip is not faster when going across the body, and may not even clear the scabbard when drawing it with your non-dominant hand. So getting to the sword and drawing it in a reverse grip is not sped up or made easier by using a reverse grip. Once the sword is in hand, the speed of the cut itself is definitely slower when using a reverse grip. In addition, the grip on the weapon itself is weaker. Your hand is not as strong on the weapon in this fashion than with the normal fashion. In addition to that, your blows become much more predictable and much easier to read when cutting in this fashion. The range or reach of the fighter is severely limited when using the sword in a reverse grip fashion. If I were to use my sword in a normal forward grip, my reach can extend fairly long. Now, if I were to switch to a reverse grip, the angle of the wrists simply cannot maneuver the weapon as far as it would in a normal forward grip. Therefore, my range is significantly limited, and in all aspects of fighting, range is definitely an advantage. Now, people might argue that the reverse grip is better for close-in fighting, where I might slash and try and cut this way. However, using the sword in a forward grip, I can slash and cut just as easily, and in this fashion, I can actually go to half swording like we discussed earlier and be much more effective than if I was trying to use a reverse grip and do half swording this way. It's much more awkward that way than with a forward grip. So there's virtually no advantage to close-in fighting or cutting or slashing using a reverse grip because your range is much more limited, it's weaker, it's slower. The other major disadvantage to using the sword in a reverse grip fashion, especially for cutting and slashing, is how exposed your hands and arm and body are to incoming blows. When I strike with my sword in a normal forward grip, the blade and the hilt act as a barrier and extend out beyond the weapon to help protect me from any incoming blows or counterattacks. As I cut, the blade and the hilt protect me and the rest of my body. As I cut, it is between my opponent and myself. It extends out in front of me and it helps to protect. Now, if I use a reverse grip, all the blade and hilt is behind my arm. My arm is now exposed to incoming blows coming this way, or shield strikes, or grappling. And before I can even get my sword around to hit the opponent, all this time I've had my body and my arms exposed to incoming blows. And there's no way that I can get this blade and this hilt out in front of me to precede my attack like I could with a normal forward grip. So any way you look at it, slashing or trying to cut with a reverse grip is an extremely bad disadvantage over using a normal forward grip. You leave yourself more exposed, more open, and it's a very dangerous situation to be in. All right, so some exceptions. There are always exceptions. The most obvious exception for using the reverse grip is with dagger work or with knife work. There is tons of evidence in the historic manuals that show knives and daggers being used in the reverse grip fashion. This is almost always done for attacks that are above basically the breastbone. So attacks coming in to the head, the neck, the upper torso. We see plenty of evidence of the reverse grip with a knife being used in this fashion. Sometimes we might see a little bit lower, but generally speaking, it's for high targets on the body with a knife. We do see that. We also see evidence of the sword being used to thrust in a reverse grip fashion. Now, thrusting is a different mechanic than cutting or slashing. It has different purposes, but we do see evidence of sometimes a sword being used in a reverse grip to thrust or stab, especially with a half sword grip or in cooperation with a grapple, being used much like a spear, which is another place you'll see a reverse grip being used instead of the forward grip or in addition to. The reverse grip on a sword used to thrust, especially in half swording, getting into the gaps of armor or used in a grapple, is completely supported by historical evidence. We also see it being used in certain situations as a hard downward thrust, usually as a killing blow. When somebody's on the ground, you can use gravity and as in addition to the fighter's weight to thrust downward in a killing blow. In those instances, we do see the reverse grip being used with the sword. Other instances in which we see the reverse grip being used to defend against longer weapons such as a spear. In this specific instance, we see two armored fighters contending in full plate. One has just thrust his spear out at the opponent. The receiving fighter has his longsword in a reverse grip with the blade pointing straight down. This movement is a simple deflection to the outside. He is not attempting to cut or chop with the spear. We can also see that his other hand is already gripping the hilt of the dagger at his waist. It seems apparent his plan is to deflect the spear aside with his sword and then rush in with his dagger to try and thrust into an opening of the armor of his opponent. The focus of this is mainly on European and European-inspired weapons, but it's also worth noting the exception in certain circles of Japanese swordsmanship. There are a few instances in certain Japanese swordplay studies that do have a draw cut using a reverse grip. Now, the practitioners of these styles I have had some conversations with, and they assured me that this is very brief and very rare, and they emphasize the advice of resuming a normal forward grip as soon as possible. And they also made it very clear to debunk any notion of continued or prolonged slashing or cutting from this position. Though the image of a fighter using a reverse grip might look cool to some, it's very clear that the practicality of using this style of fighting is just not very effective due to its absence in the historical record, as well as just the simple biomechanics of trying to use a sword safely in that fashion. It's simply not a good idea. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and I hope you've learned something. Now, the idea of debunking myths is not one to stifle creativity, but to enhance creativity. Whenever you're creating something fanciful or fantastic or unique, you want to know exactly what elements you're tweaking and twisting and how that'll affect the baseline of reality. I hope this has been fun for you, and thanks for listening.